The other thing that I want to take a look at, which is something that I think it's very helpful for increasing readability of your code and the messages that you're generating. And one of the other things that I like about it, about making prepared messages or formatted messages, is that it causes you to think about the information that you're going to need in the message, and you get to define the template or the framework for kind of what that message is going to look like and reference it later. The other thing that does for us is it will allow us to very easily swap out that message for different languages. And the reason for that is because we aren't necessarily building the message at runtime. We're grabbing the already formatted message and binding data to it. So instead of grabbing the English version, we could grab the Spanish version or the Dutch version or whatever we're looking for. Where can these be created? In other words, where can we make these prepared messages? Well, Apex refers to them as text messages, but you can also define them in your code or in your own table. A little bit later, we're going to look at a constraint lookup table, and we could potentially define our constraint lookup errors also in multiple languages, but in this case, we did not. We're just keeping it simple. So let's hop back into Apex and let's take a look at what I'm talking about. So we have several different messages that you'll see on the screen, and let me just go ahead and make this a little bit bigger so we can actually see them. There we go, that looks a little bit better. And how are we producing these messages? Well, these two messages up here are produced using Apex string.format. And I want to be completely clear that everything that's happening on this page is PL SQL. So we're not doing anything on the client yet. Everything's happening in the database. So how is it that we make this happen? How do we generate this message? Well, I could concatenate that message together, or we can take a look at kind of these prepared messages. And there's a couple different ways in which we can reference values which we'd like to bind to a prepared message. So here we say hello %s, how is the weather in %s, and then I pass in Tyson and Huntsville. So what's going to end up happening is Tyson is going to bind to the first S because it's the first parameter. Huntsville is going to bind to the second S because it's the second parameter. So I'm not directly referencing any parameter here. It's just implied that since this is the first S, I'm going to get the first parameter. This is the second S, I'm going to get the second parameter. Another way that we could do this, though, is that I could explicitly reference a particular parameter position. And I understand this example is a little bit confusing in the sense that I'm saying %1 here, but this is actually referencing the second parameter because it's 0 based. So %0 is going to grab Huntsville, %1 is going to grab Tyson, and this is because this list is 0 based. So 0 means the first parameter, 1 really means the second. Okay, so always remember, I've done this so many times where I forget that this first parameter is 0, and I put %1, and it takes me a minute to realize kind of why my message isn't showing up the way that I would like it to be. I do that more often than I'd like to admit. But one of the things that I want to point out is that Apex string.format is the method that I showed above. It supports both the methods that you just saw, the implicit and explicit reference. Another way that you can use formatted strings, which is more common, especially when you're dealing with multilingual language applications, is the Apex lang.message. Apex lang.message will actually read or pull a message from a table based off of a key, and then we'll do the data binding. The thing that's different about Apex lang.message is that it only supports the explicit parameter reference. In other words, it only supports reference like this. It will not support this %s syntax. So let's take a look at that. So here I have some messages that I have prepared as text messages, and you can see that the %s does not get replaced by any values, right? It just kind of comes through as is. Whereas for the second message, we do have values being replaced. So let's just go take a look at that code real quick.
Pardon me, Tyson.
Yes.
A couple of questions in the queue. Why would we do 0, 1, etc. when we can just use %s for all the parameters?
Great question. So every now and then, you may want to reference a parameter multiple times. A great example of this is going to be in one of my next examples, where I'm actually using that format to build a button. And one of the things that you want to do to help your end users is normally for buttons, in addition to having a label, you want to give that button a title. And more common than not, the title and the label are the same value. So I can reference that same value multiple times. One of the differences that you'll see in this code is that we have, I'm referencing a key instead of actually providing a string. And you can see that I'm routing this through or calling this from the Apex laying.message function. The question that I normally get at this time would be, well, where exactly is this message coming from? How do I define it? How do I change it? How do I modify it? Well, the way that you could do that is if you head to the shared components. It's kind of hidden down here in the bottom right-hand corner. There's a little area here called text messages. And you can see I have a couple different text messages defined. I have one called demo weather, and I have one called demo weather _s. This was just to show you that the %s syntax does not work in this capacity. The other thing that you can see is the demo weather key shows up twice. That's because one is for Spanish and the other is for English. So what I could do, and let's just take a look at the page real quick. Notice that this message is currently in English. Well, what I can do is if I go back to my shared components and I go into my globalization attributes, I'm just going to change my application's primary language to Spanish real quick. Let's go ahead and rerun this page. And now you can see that the message is now in Spanish. Now, I just want to point out this does not translate the entire application. This is strictly just for messages. If you need to translate the entire application, there is a process to do that. If you go into shared components, there's many steps that you go through here to translate the app, and that can be done. Okay, but we're just strictly talking about messages today.
Pardon me, Tyson.
Yes.
Is Apex _string available in 5.0? Do you know offhand?
I don't believe it is. I think it's only available in 5.1.
No, it isn't, Tyson.
Awesome. Thank you. Yeah, that was new with 5.1. So unfortunately, if you're using Apex 5.0, you cannot do that. I don't know if there's an open source format. I think possibly the US utils might have US string. I think that might have a format, but I'm not entirely sure. Anyway, the last thing that I wanted to talk about in terms of using these formatted messages is you could also use it to format content to some capacity. So let's go ahead and take a look at what's going on here. Okay, so what's going on here is you can see that I'm defining a template, and I'm just defining this in my code, and this is just a constant. It's all the HTML that I would need to render a button. And I just want to point something out. Notice that I'm referencing %1 and %0 multiple times. Okay, and this is so my label and my title match. The other thing that I'm doing, not that it really matters too much, is I'm basically just preparing an array of some classes that I want to apply to my button. Hot, warning, success. This is just going to change the color of the buttons. You can see in a very simple capacity, I can say apex string.format, grab my button template and bind the template button as the label. Or if I want it to be if I want to do a little bit more with this template, in addition to just binding template button as the label, I'm also going to go ahead and bind some classes. Oops. Bind a class here. So in other words, the first one's going to be hot, the second one's going to be warning, and the third one's going to be success. And this is all thanks to the way that Apex stringed-out format works. The other thing that I just want to point out is notice that when I mouse over this, that's really hard to see, but suffice to say that the label does also include the class. So it says template button, warning, and template button. The other thing that I want to point out is that if you use the Apex debug package, it supports this string format. So in other words, you can pass in the bulk of your message and then kind of bind data to it. So if you do apex debug.info, warn, error, all that stuff supports this format.